Oh wow, it feels fantastic to be back at CocoaHeads. My name is Marthin Freij, and I've been working with digital products and services for at least 2 decades, and primarily as a developer. And some of you might recognize me from CocoaHeads, this meetup, because I used to organize this for 2.5 years, and I thought that was pretty long. And then Alec came and said that he had been running this for about 4 years, and wow, that's amazing. I can't believe how you can run that so long. And actually, I had to look up how long we have been running these meetups in Stockholm for CocoaHeads. And it turned out that CocoaHeads is actually celebrating 10 years this year. So a big hand for CocoaHeads. Actually, the very first CocoaHeads meeting in Stockholm was at June 2nd, 2008. So wow. That's really cool. I'm so glad that Alec and all the other organizers are just pushing it forward and keeping the community alive. It's so great. So thank you for that. These are some of the brands and apps and sites and stuff that I've been working with. So some of you might know me from my past experience with this. But probably most of you know me as the guy who introduced Tim Cook to the iPad. And that's more or less what I'm famous for right now, I guess. So today I had an idea to talk about a few things. I'm working at a very big Swedish enterprise right now, and we're working with forestry. We have started to work a lot with apps and mobile system supports, and I wanted to give a little insight in how it is on the enterprise side, because when you work with iOS, you primarily work with consultants work or at a startup or anything like that. But not so many work with enterprise stuff. How many here work with enterprise stuff? 1, 2, 2.5. So I just wanted to give you some insights to that, and to do that, I really need to give you to set the context about the company that I work for. So bear with me. It's a short video describing the business we're in. Hopefully the sound will work. Let's see. No, it didn't work. Okay. Let's skip the movie. But we work with forestry, and we also work with big factories, with pulp mills and sawmills and stuff. So our business starts in the breathtaking forests of south of Sweden. And as you can imagine, the forests in Sweden are quite analog, and they're not digital at all. But all the metadata around the forest are very highly digital. So we have a lot of things to work with there. We have historical data, we have planned activities, maps, and all that stuff. And our employees, when they are out in the fields, in the forest, they should totally have access to this data out when they do their work. They shouldn't be dependent on a desktop or something else to do their work. So obviously we have a very strong case for mobile in the forest. And the same is actually true for our factories as well, because there are a lot of data in our factories. Stuff like temperature and quality of the product we are creating, and volumes and all that stuff. But we also have a lot of manual processes within the factories. Things like daily inspections or safety walks and a lot of other manual processes that we work with that generate a lot of paperwork. And we want to reduce that paperwork, because then we have a lot of other problems. So we want to gather this digital in different ways. So we are in a great need of context mobile support in our factories and in the forest. But also, and we missed that from the short video, but our company is owned by forest owners in south of Sweden. So we're actually a member-owned association, or what do you call it? So there are about 50,000 forest owners in south of Sweden that own my company, which is called Södra. And we see an issue because the members are changing rapidly right now. The kids growing up today doesn't grow up on the countryside close to the forest, and they actually grow up in the city. And that's probably the first generation to start doing that, and we will lose a lot of knowledge from the previous generations about how to take care of the forests and stuff. So that's why we put together this really awesome and beautiful game together with our friends at GrowPlay. And it's a beautiful game for kids, younger kids, describing the whole process of taking care of the forest and all the stuff that the forest can give us, like stuff for transportation and paper and all that stuff. So it's a beautiful game. I can highly recommend it, Grow Forest. But also we can see that owning forest is pretty close to dealing with your private finance in general. And if we look at the banks in Sweden, about 10 or 15 years ago, Swedes did about 95% of their banking errands through physical bank offices. And today, about 95% of all the banking errands are through digital channels, primarily through mobile apps, like mobile banking and stuff. And I strongly believe that this will be true for forest owners as well, to access data about their property and how to, what actions to take and which actions are planned on the property and stuff. So we have a great digital need here as well. So given all these things, I really saw when I started at Södra 2 years ago that we really need to build some knowledge on building mobile, contextual mobile system support within Södra. And that's why we created an in-house app agency at Södra. And everything started with just me trying to write some code. But I'm growing too old and too lazy probably, and I have kids and stuff, and I've lost focus on code. But I hired 2 developers, which were awesome, and they helped me to build the free apps, and we made really good success stories from these 2 apps. Or free apps. And then we started to convince the company that we should really focus on developing apps because we have a lot of needs for this kind of system support. So we started to hiring people, and now we've grown from myself to myself plus 7 developers. So we are actually 2 teams working with apps full-time right now within Södra, which is pretty awesome. But that makes the problem that it's quite hard to convince people inside the company that we should do this thing. But it's even harder to convince people outside the company, like developers, to join us, because we are not famous for doing like cool digital stuff. We are pretty analog and old and traditional and like base industry in Sweden. So we had to come up with a few things to make it really clear what we are doing. So I think Södra has a great story to tell and a great why you should work at Södra. But we had to come up with the culture and motivations on why should you work as a developer at Södra. And we started to organize ourselves in very small dedicated teams with a really high responsibility, and I think everyone is organizing in that way, so it's not us for us, but it's quite unique if you want to work in an enterprise or with forestry or other things, then it's quite unique. I think we are probably the only company in our industry that does this. And we also wanted to focus on continuous learning, to always learn new things. So even if we are working at the same company all the time, we don't want to work with the same app all the time. So we work with a lot of new things all the time. And one thing that I don't think you have when you work at a startup or as a consultant is that you have direct contact with the end users. And that's the good or the great thing with working in an enterprise. You can know every one of your users by name, more or less. And you know how old they are, where they live, and all that stuff, because they are your pals at your company, guys that you work with. So you can really have contact with the end users. And then we try to really focus on a design-driven development process. And I usually think that these two concepts are they are quite opposite to each other. Either you are very product-driven in your design process, or you are very use-driven in your process. Like Apple is very product-driven in their process because they have a holistic view on how to build the product, and they have a vision for the entire product. And then they don't ask customers that much how the app should be or how the product should be built. They have a lot of knowledge themselves. On the other side, companies like Microsoft do a lot of user research and ask and their end users what to build and what features they're missing, and then try to build an app that suits everyone. And I think we are pretty good at product design and digital products in my team, but we are not so good at the domain-specific things. So we really need to be in the intersection between these two design patterns. So the first thing we do when we find a new project or an idea within the company is that we immediately go out to the end users and start to do user studies. We just hang along for a day or two and try to understand what they are doing and what their needs are. And this is like a gold mine for me, because I can see so many informal requirements that would never ever show up in a workshop or in a traditional system requirement spec or something like that. Like they have these pelter because it's so loud, so they can't talk to each other. They have to find other ways to communicate with each other. And that's really interesting. And at the same time, they work with really scary stuff. Like people could lose their arms or legs or stuff in this process. So in this case, they are securing a particular machine from really being turned off and put a lock on it and stuff. So they have a lot of respect for this process, and you can't really communicate that respect in a workshop or anything. You really need to be there and understand it. And the same is true for when we need solutions for the forest as well, because this day was a day in September. It was really nice temperature, and it was a really good day. But there could be days where it's like winter and it's really, really cold, and we have to design the solution for all weathers and all lighting conditions and temperatures and stuff. And that makes us like think about that in the design process when we try to come up with the apps that we do. Sometimes we just do interviews and give the end users paper and pen, and they can draw the ideas they have, because some users are quite technical, so they have an idea of the app that they want, but they can't communicate the right buzzwords, so we can understand what they want. So then we let them write on paper. And we take photos of everything. Everything is like keys into how to build a perfect solution for our users. And sometimes we actually do workshops. Often we do the workshops after we have done the user studies. So we know a lot about, we know a lot of stuff about the domain, but we also need these specific knowledge from the different cases that we work with. So that's actually also a very good process. And the whole key here is to involve the end users in the design and the development process. Because if we involve the end users, they will turn into ambassadors for this product. And if we have ambassadors out in the where the app is supposed to be used, it's much easier to get the adoption right, and people start using it, and we don't have to convince people to use it because their mates and teammates and stuff can tell them why this app is so good, and describe the different decisions, product decisions that were taken in this process. So it's really good. So when we have done all this, we try to communicate all the requirements in wireframes, and I think wireframes is pretty good document, or a document to communicate requirements between both end users and developers. So for end users, it's quite clear what we are trying to achieve, and for the developers, it's quite clear to put estimates and understand the thinking here. So I think wireframes is so good because they are abstract enough to let the end users kick their imagination and come up with new ideas and not focus on colors and logotypes and stuff like that. But they are also concrete enough to communicate the intention with the design that we are trying to come up with. And then if the wireframes are approved, usually there are a lot of iterations here to nail the product design that we want to come up with. But then it's time to put our design language to the app. And we have built a design system that we can reuse. So every time we come up with a new user, like a new UX design pattern or anything like that, we try to code that and have it in a CocoaPod or a shared library that we can reuse these components all the time. So we don't, for us to work with design within the enterprise doesn't cost anything more. It's more or less the same price as doing it without good intention and good design and good functionality. So it's just part of our process. And we also, we're really focused on building really small role-based apps. So we try to have one app per role. And the reason for that is that it's really hard to fit everyone's need if you build one big app, because then you would hit like 5 or 10% of the all users' needs. But if you are creating an app for a specific role, then you can hit probably 90-95% of that role's needs. And that will also drive a lot of engagement, and people will use the app because they love it, not because they are forced to use it. So there are a lot of benefits of working with really small apps, because a smaller app is easier to develop, it's easier to maintain, it's easier to replace if we started off wrong with our IDs, and it's very easy to kill a small app. But killing a feature in a giant app is really, really hard. So I think this is pretty good. Yeah, it makes us take care of a lot of small apps, but I think it's worth it, because the opposite would be much worse, I think. So just a few quick slides on the tech stuff that we are using. Since we are in an enterprise environment, we have a lot of enterprisey stuff. And also because we are outside of the App Store ecosystem, we can't use like TestFlight and all these great services that Apple provides, and CloudKit and all that stuff. So as I said, we have a lot of internal frameworks where we try to share code between the different apps that we make to have the shared code between apps. like authentication, networking, the styling, the design system, and all that stuff. Obviously, we're using source control, and in our case, we're using GitHub. And we use GitHub for the backlog and issues and all that stuff as well. And then we use Azure Active Directory for identity and group management. And here, this is the heritage from the enterprise side. So everything in our enterprise are in Azure, and with the Azure identity parts in Active Directory. And we also build backend services in Azure with .NET Core, which is an open source version of .NET. And then we use a few Microsoft services called Visual Studio App Center, which is kind of a test flight thing because you can distribute beta builds. But it's also a build server, it's analytics, and crash reports. So if you use the old hockey app service, this is the new hockey app. And then we use mobile device management within the company. And if you don't work at a big enterprise, you probably haven't heard about mobile device management. But it's more or less, we as a company own all the iPhones and iPads, and we have more or less root access or admin access to the devices, which means that we can push out apps to the devices we own without any user interaction at all. So we can actually have we can push out an app without the user doing anything at all, which is quite convenient if you're working, if you've been in the App Store before. And all these things tie together pretty well because we push our code to GitHub, and that will kick off a build in App Center. And when App Center has built and binary and tested it with all the unit tests and stuff, we can push that to Intune, which is the MDM solution that we are using, which will push the app out to the end users. So we have a continuous deployment flow. We just push code on the master branch, and a few minutes later it will be out on all the users' devices. Probably a bit scary sometimes, but it's good because it's a very short loop, so we can always fix bugs. So yeah, we could maybe introduce a bug, but we can also fix it much faster than a week cycle to wait for the App Store release. So this is actually pretty good. And that's all I was about to tell you today. I hope it was interesting and that you could rest your coding brains for a while. So thank you so much.